I went to surprise my husband at the airport. Then he walked out holding his mistress's hand. What would you do if the person you trusted most exposed his betrayal in front of you without warning? Now, here is how it happened. Claire Dawson Mercer had gone to Logan Airport carrying her husband's favorite coffee. And 10 minutes later, she watched him walk through arrivals holding another woman's hand. At 6:42 on a cold Boston evening, Terminal B was washed in fluorescent light, rolling luggage, and the sharp smell of coffee drifting from the concourse cafe. Claire stood near the arrivals rail in a camel wool coat over a black knit dress, one hand wrapped around a paper cup marked Ryan, the other holding the flight confirmation she had checked 3 times. Ryan had spent 3 days in Chicago on what he called a Northbridge strategy trip, and for once Claire had decided not to tell him she was coming. She imagined the small surprise of seeing his face soften when he found her waiting. Instead, the sliding doors opened and Madison Blake stepped out first. Blonde hair loose over a cream coat, carry-on trailing behind her. She turned back toward Ryan with the ease of someone who knew exactly where he would be. Ryan emerged beside her in a charcoal jacket, smiling at something she said. Then Madison reached for his hand. He did not pull away. His fingers closed around hers naturally, completely, like the gesture had been practiced somewhere Claire had never been invited. Claire forgot the coffee in her hand until heat seeped through the cardboard sleeve. Ryan saw her a few seconds later. His stride broke. Madison followed his stare. Their hands separated, but too late for denial. "Claire," Ryan said. The terminal noise seemed to sharpen around his voice. A baggage cart rattled past. Someone laughed near the rideshare doors. Claire looked at Madison's shoulders and recognized the gray cashmere scarf draped around them. She had given it to Ryan on their anniversary the previous winter because he complained Boston airports were always freezing. "That's my scarf," Claire said. Madison touched the fabric once, then let her hand fall. Ryan moved closer. "This is not what it looks like." Claire looked at the space where their hands had been joined. "Then explain what it looks like." "Not here." His eyes moved toward the people waiting nearby. Even now, embarrassment seemed to concern him more than betrayal. "We'll talk at home." Madison's suitcase stood beside her, black and hard-sided, with an Aerovanta executive travel tag looped through the handle. Claire noticed it because those tags were issued only for senior leadership travel. Madison was chief commercial officer, but Claire had not approved any expanded travel status, and no board notice had crossed her desk. "You traveled together?" Claire asked. Ryan exhaled. "It was business." "And the hand?" Madison finally spoke. "Claire, don't make this worse than it has to be." The softness in her voice carried more confidence than apology. Ryan reached for Claire's elbow. She stepped back before he touched her. "How long?" she asked. Neither answered immediately. That was answer enough. Ryan lowered his voice. "Go home. I'll meet you there later." "You're leaving with her?" "We still have the Northbridge deck to finish." Madison glanced toward the curb, where a black car service had pulled forward. The driver stepped out and took both of their bags. Ryan looked at Claire as if expecting compliance from 12 years of marriage and 14 years of building Aerovanta together. "Don't make a scene," he said. Claire held his gaze, then placed the untouched coffee on the metal rail beside her. "I'm not the one who made one." Ryan turned away first. Madison followed him toward the doors, still wearing Claire's scarf. As the driver loaded the luggage, Claire watched Madison present an executive access credential at the curbside checkpoint, the same level normally reserved for Aerovanta's senior leadership travel team. Then Madison told the driver, "Take us to the office. We still have the Northbridge deck to finish." Claire remained beneath the arrivals board as their car pulled into traffic. Ryan thought the worst thing she had seen was his hand in Madison's. He had not noticed that Claire was already wondering who had authorized everything else. Ryan's second betrayal was quieter than the first. Before Claire had even left the airport, he began speaking as though her place inside Aerovanta could be reassigned as easily as the seat beside him. She remained near the Terminal B arrivals rail for another minute after the black car disappeared into Boston traffic, her camel coat buttoned against the draft from the sliding doors. The coffee-marked Ryan sat untouched on the metal ledge. Claire picked it up only to throw it away, then checked her phone. 3 messages waited. The first was from Ryan. "Go home. We'll talk tonight." The second came less than a minute later. "Please don't contact the board or anyone at Northbridge until we've had a chance to discuss this privately." The third came from Madison. and that one made Claire stop walking. I'm sorry you found out like that. Ryan and I have been trying to manage the timing. Claire read the sentence twice. Manage the timing. Not regret. Not mistake. Timing. She opened the Aerovana leadership portal from her phone. Madison's formal title still read Chief Commercial Officer, but her travel credential had been upgraded that morning to Executive Strategic Access, granting access to senior client travel, Northbridge preparation rooms, and executive transport. Ryan's approval code appeared beside the change. The upgrade did not make Madison president, and it did not transfer ownership or board authority, but it let her move through the company as though the promotion had already happened. Claire saved a screenshot. Ryan called before she reached the parking garage. I told you not to start digging through systems. I'm checking company records. You're proving why I wanted to speak first. His voice had the clipped calm he used with investors when someone challenged his assumptions. Madison and I are handling the Northbridge presentation tonight. She needs access. You gave her executive credentials without board notice. I'm CEO. You're CEO of daily operations. You're not the board. Ryan gave a short, irritated laugh. You always retreat into governance language when you're upset, and you always call it language when the rules apply to you. Silence held for a beat. Then Madison's voice sounded in the background. Tell her we're late. Ryan lowered his voice. This is bigger than our marriage. Northbridge needs to see stable leadership. You've been buried in product and operations for years. Madison understands the commercial side and the future investors care about. Claire stopped beside a concrete pillar painted with the garage level number. What exactly have you told Northbridge about my role? That leadership is evolving. Meaning you may step back after the separation. I haven't agreed to a separation. You saw us. That answers the marriage. It does not answer my job. Ryan exhaled. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Aerovanta cannot freeze because you're hurt. The sentence landed harder than Claire expected. 14 years of building scheduling logic, surviving overnight system failures, and turning airport chaos into software Ryan could sell had been reduced to hurt. She looked down at the black executive tag hanging from her own work bag. Whose idea was the travel upgrade? She asked. Mine. And Madison's use of the Northbridge executive briefing room? Mine. Did the board approve any change in her officer status? Not yet. There it was. Not yet. Ryan believed sequence could be reversed. Use the title, assume the access, create the appearance, secure the investment, then let governance catch up afterward. We'll talk at home, he repeated. Claire ended the call without agreeing. Before leaving the airport, she requested the access change log through the company system and saved Ryan's messages. Then she opened the Northbridge project folder. A leadership deck had been updated 40 minutes earlier. On the cover page, Madison Blake was labeled Executive Transition Lead. Claire's own name appeared beneath a smaller line. Operations Continuity, Transitioning. No board action authorized either description. Ryan had walked out of arrivals holding Madison's hand. By the time Claire reached her car, he was already using company systems to make it look as though she had let go of Aerovana too. By the next morning, Ryan had turned the affair into paperwork because he believed Claire would be easier to remove from Aerovanta if her exit looked voluntary. At 8:36 a.m., Claire sat in the glass conference room outside her operations office in Boston's Seaport District, still wearing the black knit dress from the night before beneath a fresh charcoal blazer. She had slept less than 3 hours. On the table beside her were the airport access log, screenshots of Madison's upgraded credential, and the Northbridge leadership deck calling Claire transitioning. Ryan entered carrying a Navy document folder and closed the door behind him. We need to separate the marriage from the company, he said. Claire looked at the folder. That would be easier if you stopped using the company to manage the marriage. He ignored the remark and pushed the documents toward her. The first page was a marital separation acknowledgement. The second was a resignation from her role as Chief Product and Operations Officer. The third offered to repurchase her 41% founder stake using Aerovanta's last internal valuation, calculated before the Northbridge investment could raise the company's value. The final document was a voting proxy authorizing Ryan to exercise her shareholder votes during the proposed transition. Claire read each page without touching the pen clipped to the folder. You prepared this before last night, she said. I prepared for reality. Ryan sat across from her. Northbridge is too important for the company to become collateral damage. The affair became public because you walked through Logan holding Madison's hand. And I'm trying to keep that from destroying 14 years of work. Claire turned to the proxy. If she signed it, Ryan would control his own 41% plus hers, giving him 82% of the voting power. That would place him above the 75% threshold required for major actions affecting founder control. The document did not take her shares. It asked her to surrender the votes attached to them. "Why do you need my proxy if you think the divorce will solve this anyway?" she asked. Ryan's expression hardened. "Because the board needs stability now, not after 18 months of litigation. So this is not about separating the marriage from the company. It's about protecting Aerovanta." The door opened before Claire answered. Madison stepped inside wearing an ivory suit and carrying 2 coffees. She set one beside Ryan without asking whether Claire wanted anything. "We have the Northbridge rehearsal in 40 minutes, she said. Then her eyes moved to the folder. "Did she sign?" Claire looked at her. "You seem unusually interested in my voting rights." Madison folded her arms. "I'm interested in making sure the company survives this." "This? Your separation?" Claire felt the precision of the insult. In less than 12 hours, Madison had gone from mistress caught at arrivals to executive speaking, as though Claire's marriage and corporate position were already settled facts. Ryan tapped the repurchase offer. "The price is fair, based on the valuation before Northbridge. Because Northbridge has not closed. Yet you're telling everyone the investment is effectively done." Madison answered this time. "Because commercially it is." Claire glanced at her. "Then why does Ryan need my shares before it closes?" Neither responded immediately. Claire closed the folder. "I'm not signing the resignation, the repurchase, or the proxy." Ryan leaned forward. "If you drag this into divorce court, the economic value of these shares will be examined whether you like it or not. Economic value is not the same as your right to vote them today. You are making technical distinctions while the company is moving. Those distinctions are why you put 4 signature tabs in this folder." Ryan stood. "Take it to counsel. When you're ready to be practical, call me." Claire gathered the entire package, including the unsigned proxy and repurchase offer, and placed it in her work bag. She did not argue with Madison. She did not touch Ryan's coffee. In the hallway, she forwarded scanned copies to the corporate attorney already handling her separation and added one instruction. "Please confirm the current cap table, my voting rights, Madison's officer status, and whether any board action authorizes the leadership changes now being represented." Ryan believed he had handed Claire an exit. What he had actually handed her was written proof that he still needed her consent before he could control the company he had begun pretending was his alone. The first thing Claire's attorney confirmed was that Ryan could not cast a single one of her votes without the signature he had failed to get. At 9:18 that morning, Claire stood beside the windows of her operations office in Boston's Seaport District, the harbor washed pale beneath a low August sky. The Navy document folder remained open on her desk beside the screenshots from Logan Airport and the altered Northbridge leadership deck. Her attorney's voice came through the speakerphone, calm and exact. "The current cap table is unchanged," he said. "You hold 41% of Aerovanta's voting shares. Ryan holds 41. The management and employee pool holds 18. No transfer, no proxy, no resignation." Claire looked down at the unsigned voting authorization. "And the divorce may eventually affect economic claims or settlement value. It does not automatically transfer your voting rights today." That distinction was the hinge Ryan had hoped she would miss. He had told her the company needed stability, but the proxy proved he still needed her consent to obtain it on his terms. "Madison's status?" Claire asked. Papers shifted on the other end of the call. "Chief Commercial Officer. I see no valid board action appointing her president." "The travel upgrade?" "Administrative access Ryan can authorize within ordinary executive operations. It does not make her a corporate officer." Claire let out one slow breath. "What about the 7% equity proposal? Draft only. No board approval. No shareholder authorization." She crossed to the desk and touched the folder with 2 fingers. "I don't want an injunction. Not yet. What do you want?" "Preserve the records. Cap table, board minutes, officer appointments, shareholder communications, Northbridge materials, and anything tied to the repurchase or proxy." Her attorney agreed. The next step was procedural, not dramatic. A preservation notice would go to corporate counsel and the secretary responsible for governance records. It would not freeze Aerovanta, remove Ryan as CEO, or block legitimate business. It would simply make clear that no one should alter or discard documents connected to ownership, officer status, equity, or the Northbridge transaction while the dispute was active. And the Northbridge deal? Claire asked. Still conditional. No final closing appears in the materials we have. Do not contact Northbridge yet. Understood. Across the office, Ryan still believed Claire was negotiating price rather than position. He told Madison the refusal to sign was predictable. She'll come around when counsel explains how ugly divorce can get, he said. Madison sat in the conference room wearing the same ivory suit, reviewing the next Northbridge presentation. A revised slide now read Madison Blake, incoming president. Ryan approved the deck anyway. 15 minutes later, the corporate secretary stopped the distribution. The internal notice was brief. Officer titles must reflect current board-approved status. Proposed equity must be labeled unapproved. No founder voting authority may be reassigned without valid documentation. Madison called Ryan immediately. They're blocking the deck. Who is that? Governance. Ryan walked out of his office with the notice in his hand and demanded the president designation be restored. The secretary refused. There is no board resolution. I'm the CEO. You are. She is still CCO. Claire watched from the far end of the corridor without approaching. Ryan saw her and assumed the timing meant she had engineered the humiliation. Happy, he asked. I didn't change the record, Claire said. I only asked what it said. He turned away before she could say more. Her attorney's written confirmation arrived moments later. Claire Dawson Mercer remained the registered holder of 41% of Aerovanta's voting shares. No proxy or transfer had been recorded. Madison Blake remained chief commercial officer, and no 7% grant had been approved. Ryan believed Claire was clinging to technicalities because she was hurt. The company record had just confirmed that the technicalities were the only reason his plan still needed her permission. By noon, the first visible crack in Ryan's plan appeared on a conference room screen when Madison's new title vanished in front of the same executives she had expected to impress. Claire sat 3 seats from the end of the polished table at Aerovanta's Seaport headquarters, a legal pad open in front of her and her hands folded loosely beside it. Ryan stood near the display wall in shirt sleeves, pushing through the Northbridge rehearsal with the fast, controlled energy he used whenever he wanted motion to feel like certainty. Madison sat beside him in her ivory suit, one ankle crossed over the other, a printed deck resting beneath her fingertips. The title slide advanced. Ryan Mercer, CEO. Madison Blake, President, Commercial and Strategy. Claire Dawson Mercer, Transition Advisor. The room barely had time to absorb it before the presentation froze. A message appeared from the corporate secretary in the internal deck system. Officer title not supported by current board record. Please correct before external distribution. No one spoke for a moment. Ryan's jaw tightened. Madison leaned forward. That was already approved for the rehearsal. Not the title, said the corporate secretary from the opposite side of the room. You remain chief commercial officer. Madison looked toward Ryan rather than Claire. You said this was settled. It will be, Ryan replied. Then it should read proposed, the secretary said. Until the board acts. Ryan clicked past the slide. The next problem arrived 2 pages later. A compensation graphic referred to Madison's 7% leadership equity participation. Another governance flag appeared beside it. Proposed, not approved. Ryan stopped the presentation. Can we turn off these automated warnings? The secretary did not raise her voice. They aren't automated. I added them because the materials are being prepared for an outside investor. A faint shift moved around the table. Claire could feel it without looking up. Executives who had spent the morning treating Ryan's transition as inevitable were suddenly reading the same words more carefully. Madison's face remained composed, but she slid the printed deck closed. Ryan turned toward. Claire, did you ask for this? I asked for the records to be accurate. You're using governance to sabotage a transaction. Claire met his eyes. If accurate titles sabotage it, the title isn't the problem. Ryan stared at her for half a second, then resumed the meeting. His voice stayed polished, but the rhythm had changed. Every claim now seemed to require a qualifier. Proposed. Pending. Subject to approval. Not yet final. Afterward, Madison caught Claire near the glass corridor outside the conference room. You know what this looks like, she said. A personal dispute bleeding into the company. Claire adjusted the strap of her work bag, then stopped using company documents to settle the personal dispute. Madison's mouth tightened. Ryan is trying to keep Aerovanta moving. So am I. You're leaving eventually. Claire paused. Who told you that? Madison gave a small, confident smile. You really think investors want two founders fighting through a divorce? Claire said nothing. She watched Madison walk away toward Ryan's office, heels striking evenly against the floor. Later that afternoon, Claire returned to the Northbridge project folder and opened the version of the leadership deck scheduled for external review. The language had changed again. Madison was now listed as incoming president, subject to board confirmation. Her 7% equity was labeled proposed. But Claire's own line had become more definitive. Departing founder. Operations transition support. She scrolled farther. A timeline showed her handing operational authority to Madison before the projected Northbridge closing. Another page described Ryan and Madison as the leadership team that would carry Aerovanta into its post-investment phase. Claire sat very still. The airport had shown her an affair. The corporate deck showed her something larger. Ryan and Madison were not merely planning a life together. They were already designing a version of Aerovanta in which Claire's exit had been written before she had agreed to leave. Years before Ryan began speaking as though Aerovanta belonged to him, Claire had been the one standing beside him at 2 a.m, holding the company. Together with cold coffee, handwritten contingency maps, and a promise she thought meant the same thing to both of them. The memory came back while she sat alone in her seaport office staring at the Northbridge deck that called her a departing founder. 13 years earlier, Aerovanta had occupied 2 cramped rooms above a machine parts distributor in South Boston, with 4 desks, mismatched monitors, and a conference table rescued from a closing law office. Ryan had been brilliant in front of investors, even then. Claire had been the one who noticed when the software failed in ways a pitch deck could not explain. During their first serious airport deployment, a winter storm rolled across New England and turned a scheduling defect into operational chaos. Gates were reassigned faster than the system could reconcile them. Ground crews received conflicting instructions. One customer threatened to cancel before sunrise. Ryan paced beside the whiteboard, phone pressed to his ear, arguing that the vendor should absorb the blame. Claire pulled off her coat, tied back her hair, and started rebuilding the recovery sequence by hand. She mapped the airport's real decision chain instead of the one their software assumed existed. At 2:17 a.m., she changed the escalation logic. At 3:04, she found the conflict between crew assignment and gate release timing. By dawn, the system was stable enough for the customer to keep operating. Ryan stood beside her in the empty conference room, both of them exhausted, and rested his forehead against hers. We built this together, he whispered. Claire believed him. A week later, he presented the recovery to investors. He described the solution fluently, praised our engineering team, and never mentioned that Claire had designed the fix. She noticed. She also noticed that the investors leaned toward him when he spoke and relaxed when he made complexity sound simple. On the train home, Ryan apologized. You know I wasn't trying to take credit. Claire looked at their reflection in the dark window. The next time, say my name. He squeezed her hand. I will. She let it go because the company had 6 employees, 3 months of runway, and no room for founders fighting over applause. Years later, when Northbridge suffered a major disruption during an early Aerovanta rollout, the pattern returned in a more polished form. Claire spent nearly 30 hours at the operations center with airport managers, dispatch teams, and Northbridge technical staff, redesigning the workflow until delays stopped cascading across the network. Victor Lang watched her work without interrupting. When the system stabilized, he told Ryan quietly, within Claire's hearing, whatever you build next, keep her close to the operations. She sees the failure before the dashboard does. Ryan laughed and put an arm around Claire's shoulders. That's why we're a team. But interviews that followed described Ryan as the visionary founder who had transformed airport operations. Claire corrected him once, then less often. Eventually, hardly at all. Silence had seemed cheaper than conflict. It protected employees, customers, fundraising rounds, and the marriage she still believed existed beneath the imbalance. Ryan mistook that restraint for agreement. "We built this together" slowly became, "I built this company, then my board, then my investors," until even Claire's role sounded temporary when he said it aloud. That afternoon, she opened the secure corporate archive and found the scanned founder records from Airovanta's formation 14 years earlier. Her name appeared beside Ryan's on the original capitalization schedule. Claire Dawson, 41% voting shares. Ryan Mercer, 41%. 18% reserved for management and employees. Beneath the signatures was the same governance agreement they had both executed before the wedding. Ryan's signature was unmistakable. He had once signed his name under the structure that made them equal founders. Now he was building a future that depended on pretending he had forgotten what that signature meant. Ryan had signed the structure that protected Claire's authority 14 years earlier. What he had forgotten was that marriage had never replaced it. The next morning, Claire sat with corporate counsel in a small conference room 2 floors below Airovanta's executive offices. The original capitalization schedule opened beside the shareholder agreement she and Ryan had signed when the company was formed. There was no hidden trust, no secret offshore entity, no late discovered asset. The ownership had always been exactly where the record said it was. Claire Dawson's 41% of Airovanta's voting stock remained registered in her own name. Ryan Mercer held 41% in his. The remaining 18% sat in the management and employee pool. Their wedding 2 years later had changed their personal lives, not the company's cap table. Counsel pointed to the section Claire had already seen years ago, but never expected to need against her husband. Certain actions that could materially change founder control required 75% shareholder approval. Ryan's 41% was not enough. Neither was Claire's. The structure forced both founders to negotiate whenever a transaction threatened to reshape control. Ryan had signed beneath that language himself. "He'll argue that the divorce changes the economics," Claire said. "It may affect valuation or eventual settlement," counsel replied. "But unless you sign a valid transfer or voting proxy, or a court enters an enforceable order affecting those shares, he cannot simply vote them because you're married or because you separate." Claire looked at the unsigned proxy Ryan had handed her. The irony was almost clinical. He had already demonstrated that he understood the limit. Because if he truly believed divorce automatically gave him control, he would never have needed her signature. The officer issue was equally plain. Airovanta's board, not Ryan alone, had authority over formal executive appointments at that level. Madison remained chief commercial officer until the board approved something else. Ryan could give her broader operating access within his CEO authority, but he could not transform that access into a board-sanctioned presidency by repetition. The proposed 7% equity grant faced the same problem. It could be drafted, discussed, modeled, even promised informally, but not issued in a way that materially altered founder control without the approvals required under the company's existing governance. Claire absorbed the details without triumph. Every line made the betrayal feel less impulsive and more deliberate. Ryan had not misunderstood the system because it was obscure. He had simply started treating formal limits as obstacles he could outrun. The final document on the table was the Northbridge Conditional Investment Framework sent 10 weeks earlier. Claire's name appeared in the integration appendix as the required Chief Product and Operations Officer and operational lead for the initial deployment period. Northbridge could consent to a replacement, but no such consent had been given. Ryan had received the same package. His comments were still visible in the tracked review copy. Notes beside valuation, funding amount, closing milestones, and rollout timing. The appendix naming Claire had no comment at all. Counsel looked at her. He had access to this. Claire remembered Ryan mentioning the Northbridge numbers over dinner and dismissing the operational appendix as implementation detail. Madison had also worked from the same project room. Neither had hidden the document from Claire. They had simply assumed she would be gone before its language mattered. That assumption had now collided with their own transition plan. Claire opened the latest external deck again. It still described her as departing founder, still positioned Madison as incoming president, and still presented the Northbridge investment as effectively settled. Beside it sat the unsigned proxy, the unapproved equity proposal, and the conditional investment package requiring Claire's continued role. Ryan and Madison had already begun presenting a corporate future that depended on rights they did not yet possess. By announcing around the approvals instead of obtaining them, They had created the very governance conflict that could force every claim about ownership, leadership, and the Northbridge deal back into formal review. By the fifth week, Claire understood that Ryan and Madison were not merely trying to survive an affair. They were trying to make her absence look inevitable before anyone with authority had actually approved it. She sat alone in Arovana's product lab after most of the floor had gone dark, the latest Northbridge presentation glowing across two monitors. The plan was no longer difficult to read. Ryan intended to announce the strategic investment as effectively complete, present Madison as incoming president, describe Claire as a departing founder, and attach the proposed 7% equity grant to what he called the company's post-investment leadership structure. In a separate internal timeline, Claire's operational responsibilities were shown moving to Madison before the expected Northbridge closing. The sequence mattered. First, create the appearance of a finished transition. Then let employees, investors, and eventually the board absorb it as reality. Once the company had publicly reorganized around Ryan and Madison, they expected Claire to face the choice they thought she always made: protect Arovana from conflict, accept a negotiated exit, and let everyone else call that compromise. Claire leaned back and studied the numbers. Ryan understood some of the problem. He knew he could not simply take her 41%. That was why the repurchase offer existed. He knew he could not vote those shares without permission. That was why he had drafted the proxy. He knew Madison's 7% grant was not yet real. That was why the new deck now labeled it proposed. What he misunderstood was how many separate approvals he was trying to replace with momentum. The shareholder agreement still required 75% for actions that materially changed founder control. The board still had authority over officer appointments. Claire had not resigned, had not transferred her shares, and had not given Ryan her votes. And Northbridge had never waived the requirement that she remain the operational lead during the initial integration period. Ryan appeared to believe all of those limits would become negotiable once the room was full, the slides were projected, and the investment was spoken about as though the signatures were already dry. Madison understood even less, though not because she had never seen the paperwork. She had worked from the Northbridge project room for weeks. She knew her president title was pending. She knew the 7% grant still required approval. But Claire could see the assumption beneath every revision. Madison believed Ryan would control the board after the separation because Claire would sell rather than endure a prolonged corporate fight. The affair had convinced her that possession in one part of Ryan's life meant possession in the others. Claire closed the deck and opened the invitation that had arrived directly from Northbridge earlier that afternoon. The summit would be held Friday evening at the Boston Harbor Conference Center, followed by a private leadership session. Her invitation did not say spouse. It did not say departing founder. It read, Claire Dawson Mercer, Chief Product and Operations Officer, Integration Lead. Victor Lang's office had sent it through the same distribution list used for the transaction team. Claire stared at the title for several seconds. She could have called Northbridge immediately. She could have forwarded every internal contradiction and forced Ryan to explain himself before the event. Instead, she did nothing. Not because she was afraid, and not because she planned to ambush him. She simply wanted the claims tested where each side would have to stand behind them. Ryan and Madison had spent weeks building a future on an unsigned proxy, an unapproved promotion, an unissued equity grant, and a client waiver that did not exist. Claire accepted the summit invitation, closed her laptop, and left the building. If Ryan wanted to make their version of Arovana public, she would let him finish the presentation. The room had already decided Claire was leaving before anyone bothered to ask whether she had agreed. Friday evening, the Northbridge Aviation Summit filled the Boston Harbor Conference Center with polished glass, harbor light, dark suits, and the low murmur of executives pretending not to watch one another. Claire arrived alone in a fitted navy dress beneath a long charcoal coat. Her hair swept back from her face, her badge reading exactly what Northbridge had sent her. Chief Product and Operations Officer, Integration Lead. She did not correct anyone. She did not seek Ryan. She moved through the reception area with the stillness of someone who had spent weeks watching words become evidence. Across the room, Ryan stood beside Madison beneath a wall-sized Northbridge logo. He wore a black suit and the relaxed confidence of a man convinced the difficult part was over. Madison, in a pale silver dress with a structured blazer draped over one arm, accepted congratulations from two Aerovanta executives who had clearly been told more than the board had approved. Big night, one of them said. Madison smiled. A new chapter. Claire heard it and kept walking. When Ryan finally saw her, his expression tightened for less than a second before settling back into public charm. You came. I was invited. I thought counsel would tell you this wasn't the place to make a point. Claire looked toward the ballroom doors. I'm not here to make one. That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. Minutes later, attendees were called inside. Ryan took the stage first. The presentation began with market growth, airport expansion, and the proposed Northbridge investment. Then the leadership slide appeared. Ryan Mercer, CEO. Madison Blake, incoming president. Claire Dawson Mercer, departing founder/transition advisor. Claire watched without moving. Ryan spoke smoothly. As part of Aerovanta's next phase, Claire is transitioning away from day-to-day leadership, while Madison will take a broader executive role guiding commercial growth and integration. Madison joined him at the podium. Claire helped build the foundation, she said, smiling toward the audience. And Ryan and I are focused on what comes next. A few people applauded. Claire did not. She looked instead at the Northbridge executives seated in the front row. No one there was applauding either. The final portion of the session moved into transaction certification. A Northbridge legal representative placed a tablet and printed acknowledgement on the lectern for Aerovanta leadership to confirm that the information presented regarding ownership, executive status, and equity commitments was accurate to the best of their knowledge. Ryan signed first. His hand did not hesitate. Madison signed the leadership acknowledgement beneath her current corporate title, then paused. Ryan leaned toward her and said quietly, but not quietly enough, add president. The board will ratify it. Madison wrote president beside her name. Claire felt something cold and final settle inside her. They were no longer speaking loosely in hallways. They were certifying the version they had created. Ryan looked toward Claire as if expecting protest. She gave him none. Then Victor Lang rose from the front row. The room quieted almost immediately. He did not look angry. He looked precise. Before we continue, he said, Northbridge needs clarification on several material discrepancies between tonight's representations and the transaction records already in our possession. Ryan's face changed. Victor turned toward Claire. Ms. Dawson Mercer, since the engagement documents identify you as Aerovanta's integration lead, would you please join us at the front and clarify whether you have resigned, transferred your voting authority, or authorized the leadership changes presented tonight? Victor did not ask Claire to defend herself. He asked Northbridge Counsel to put the existing transaction records on the screen. The first document was Aerovanta's current capitalization table, certified through the company's governance records and already included in Northbridge diligence. Claire Dawson Mercer, 41% voting shares. Ryan Mercer, 41%. Management and employee pool, 18%. No transfer from Claire appeared anywhere. The second document was the voting proxy Ryan had sent her 5 weeks earlier. Northbridge's counsel had obtained the unsigned version through the transaction file after governance preservation began. The signature line beneath Claire's name was blank. So there is no current authority for Mr. Mercer to vote Ms. Dawson Mercer's shares, counsel said. Ryan stepped toward the lectern. That proxy was part of a separation process. It doesn't change the fact that we're restructuring leadership. Victor raised one hand, not to silence him, but to stop the presentation from advancing. Then we should verify. The restructuring. The board officer record appeared next. Ryan remained Chief Executive Officer. Claire remained Chief Product and Operations Officer. Madison remained Chief Commercial Officer. There was no board resolution appointing Madison president. Beside that record was the proposed 7% equity grant, still marked unapproved. Ryan reached for the tablet he had signed minutes earlier and scrolled rapidly through the certification. This was understood to be forward-looking. Northbridge Counsel shook her head. You certified current ownership, current executive status, and authorized equity commitments. Madison immediately looked down at the word president she had written beside her own name. She took the pen from the lectern and tried to draw a line through it. Counsel placed a hand over the document. Please don't alter the signed acknowledgement. Madison released the pen. Claire stood several feet away, hands relaxed at her sides. She had imagined this moment in darker forms during the weeks after Logan Airport, but standing there now, she felt no pleasure in watching them struggle. Only clarity. Victor turned to her. Have you resigned from Aerovanta? No. Transferred your shares? No. Granted Mr. Mercer a voting proxy? No. He nodded once. And have you authorized Ms. Blake's appointment as president or the proposed equity grant? No. Ryan moved around the lectern. She doesn't have unilateral veto power over the company. Neither do you, Claire said quietly. Northbridge Council brought up the shareholder agreement next, the same agreement both founders had signed 14 years earlier. The 75% approval threshold for actions materially affecting founder control was highlighted, not as a newly discovered weapon, but as part of the diligence file Ryan had already received. His 41% could not satisfy it. Claire's 41% could not satisfy it either. The structure required process. Finally, the Northbridge Conditional Investment Framework appeared. The transaction remained subject to final diligence, and the integration appendix still named Claire as required operational lead unless Northbridge gave written consent to a replacement. No consent had been issued. Ryan stopped arguing and pulled out his phone, calling someone from Aerovanta's executive team. Freeze the external deck, he said. Take Madison's president title off everything. It was the first time that evening he had acted as though the record mattered. Victor looked to Northbridge Council. Effective immediately, place the proposed investment on governance hold. Suspend Aerovanta's authority to represent the transaction as secured. Until our review is complete, all communications regarding this investment will go through the designated governance channel, not through Mr. Mercer's office alone. Ryan lowered his phone. He was still CEO. He still owned 41%. But for the first time since the airport, he no longer controlled the story simply because he spoke first. By 9 the next morning, Aerovanta's board was in emergency session, and for the first time Ryan had to explain his decisions to people who could ask for records instead of accepting his version of events. Claire sat at the far end of the conference table with the same charcoal blazer folded over the back of her chair, her hands resting beside a legal pad she had barely written on. The special meeting had been called after Northbridge placed the investment on governance hold. No one discussed the affair. The board stayed where the damage could be measured: officer status, equity representations, transaction authority, and the statements Ryan and Madison had certified the night before. The corporate secretary confirmed the current record first. Claire remained chief product and operations officer and holder of 41% of the voting shares. Ryan remained CEO with 41%. Madison remained chief commercial officer with her existing 2% equity. The proposed 7% grant had never been approved. The unsigned voting proxy gave Ryan no authority over Claire's shares. None of that was new. What changed was that the board could no longer treat the discrepancies as private tension between two founders. Ryan had presented them to an outside investor and signed behind them. One of the directors asked why Madison had been shown as incoming president without a board resolution. Ryan answered that he expected ratification. Expected by whom? The independent director asked. Ryan glanced toward Madison. By management. Management does not appoint officers by expectation. Madison shifted in her chair. Her eyes dropped to the printed deck in front of her, then to the page showing the proposed 7% equity award. Ryan told me the equity would become effective after Northbridge closed, she said. That was the plan, Ryan replied. You told me it was committed. Commercially, it was. Claire watched Madison's expression change as the distinction finally reached her. Ryan had promised her a presidency the board had not approved, equity he could not issue alone, and a post-closing future tied to an investment Northbridge had not completed. He had not been hiding a secret source of control. He had been borrowing authority from outcomes he assumed would happen. After 2 hours, the board voted to place all Northbridge negotiations under a temporary special committee pending completion of the governance review. Ryan remained CEO and retained his shares, but he could no longer negotiate the investment or represent its status without committee authorization. External Northbridge communications would be routed through the designated review process. Madison was removed from the transaction team and directed to use only her current CCO title. Her proposed additional equity was withdrawn from consideration until the review concluded. You're crippling the company over wording, Ryan said. No, the independent director replied. We're preventing more wording from becoming liability. A finance update followed. Several employees had already asked whether the Northbridge hold threatened hiring plans or payroll. 2 customers had requested reassurance after hearing rumors about leadership instability. Ryan turned toward Claire. This is what happens when founder disputes become public. She held his gaze. Then we should stop making employees pay for founder disputes. The room quieted. Claire asked that existing customer work continue without interruption. That payroll and ordinary operating approvals remain outside the special committee unless directly connected to Northbridge, and that staff receive a factual notice saying the company remained operational while governance review continued. She did not ask the board to remove Ryan as CEO. She did not demand that Madison be fired on the spot. She did not try to collapse Aerovanta just to make Betrayal expensive. By the time the meeting ended, Ryan still had his office, his title, and his 41%. What he no longer had was the ability to promise other people Claire's votes, the board's approval, or Northbridge's money as though all 3 belonged to him. Claire gathered her papers and stood. The company had been built by hundreds of people who had never stepped into Logan Airport that night. Whatever happened next, she had decided they would not become collateral damage for a marriage they had nothing to do with. Over the next 7 weeks, Claire rebuilt the parts of Aerovanta that had been treated as personal property without turning the company into a weapon against the people who depended on it. The special committee finished its review in stages, separating Ryan's conduct around Northbridge from the ordinary work of running a 400-person software company. At Claire's request, the board did not suspend payroll, customer support, airport deployments, or routine vendor payments while the founder dispute continued. Instead, it approved a narrower governance reset. Executive officer titles could no longer appear in investor or customer materials until the corresponding board action was entered into the corporate record. Material equity proposals had to be reviewed against the shareholder approval thresholds before they could be described as committed compensation. Any future transaction involving both founders would pass through the independent director and designated committee before external claims were made about ownership or control. None of those changes increased Claire's 41%. They simply made it harder for anyone to pretend that 41% was 82. Ryan remained CEO during the transition, but the Northbridge process stayed outside his unilateral control. He could manage normal operations, approve budgets within existing authority, and lead customer work already under contract. He could not tell Northbridge that the investment was secured, speak for Claire's votes, or present Madison's promotion as completed. The restriction offended him because it forced him to live inside the same procedural boundaries he had spent weeks calling technicalities. Madison's consequences were less dramatic and more permanent. She remained chief commercial officer while the review concluded, but her role was narrowed away from Northbridge and founder transition planning. The proposed additional 7% equity package was formally withdrawn. After several weeks, she negotiated a transition out of the executive leadership team and agreed to remain long enough to hand active commercial accounts to the managers who had actually been serving them. There was no escort from the building, no public confrontation, no announcement designed to shame her. She simply lost the future title and ownership stake that had never been validly hers. Claire's divorce moved on a separate track. Through counsel, she rejected Ryan's original pre-Northbridge repurchase offer but agreed that any settlement involving her founder shares would use an independent valuation process rather than a number chosen by either spouse. Until a valid settlement changed the ownership, her voting rights remained where they had always been. She did not use the uncertainty to threaten employees or customers. When finance warned that some staff feared layoffs if Northbridge walked away, Claire asked the board to preserve the management and employee equity pool rather than use it as bargaining material between the founders. The board agreed that the existing pool would remain untouched during the dispute. Northbridge, satisfied that Aerovanta had corrected its governance representations, resumed due diligence without promising a closing date. Claire returned to product reviews, airport workflow sessions, and the work that had once disappeared behind Ryan's presentations. One evening, she stayed late in the seaport office while the harbor lights reflected across a screen full of deployment maps. Her phone showed an upcoming Northbridge operations session with her name listed first under integration. She stared at it for a moment, then closed the laptop and slipped on her coat. For weeks, she had been measuring freedom in signatures she refused to give and titles she refused to surrender. Now the company was steadier, The employees were protected from the worst of the fallout, and the marriage was finally being handled as a marriage instead of a takeover strategy. Claire stepped into the elevator alone, no longer asking whether Ryan understood what he had almost taken from her. The only question left was whether she still needed him to understand it all. 10 months after Claire went to Logan Airport hoping to surprise her husband, she returned to the same terminal for a reason that had nothing to do with Ryan. Morning light spilled across the glass at Terminal B as Aerovana's operations team gathered beside a bank of live deployment screens, watching the first phase of the Northbridge rollout coordinate gate assignments, ground crews, and disruption recovery across the airport. The strategic investment had ultimately closed after Northbridge completed its diligence, and Aerovanta corrected the leadership and governance representations that had placed the transaction on hold. Claire remained Chief Product and Operations Officer and held the same 41% voting stake she had owned before the marriage began to unravel. Ryan still held 41% and remained CEO, but the company no longer treated expectation as authorization. Officer appointments were documented before titles appeared outside the boardroom. Material equity proposals were reviewed before anyone described them as promised. The management and employee pool remained at 18%, protected from becoming bargaining material in the founder's divorce. Most employees had never learned every private detail, and Claire preferred it that way. They knew the company had survived a governance crisis. They knew payroll had continued, customers had been protected, and the Northbridge deployment had moved forward, without asking hundreds of people to choose sides in a broken marriage. Madison was no longer part of executive leadership. Her transition had ended months earlier after her commercial accounts were handed to other managers, and the additional 7% equity package she had expected was never issued. No announcement celebrated her departure. No one needed one. Ryan and Claire's divorce had also reached settlement through counsel and independent valuation rather than the rushed repurchase he had first placed before her. They left the marriage without pretending that one spouse's pain automatically transferred the other founder's corporate rights. Claire had stopped measuring progress by what Ryan lost. She measured it by what no one else had been forced to lose because of them. After the deployment briefing, she walked toward the arrivals level with a tablet tucked beneath her arm. Victor Lang was already ahead with the Northbridge engineers, discussing the next airport in the rollout. Near the sliding doors, Claire saw Ryan waiting beside a column. He had come from a separate executive meeting, his suit jacket folded over one arm. For a moment, neither spoke. Behind him, travelers emerged with carry-ons, flowers, tired children, and people scanning the crowd for familiar faces. "Strange place to end up again," Ryan said. Claire looked toward the same stretch of flooring where she had once stood holding his coffee. "It's an airport. People come back." He gave a small nod. "I thought that night was the moment everything fell apart." Claire's eyes moved to the operations screens visible beyond the glass corridor. "No. That was the moment I finally saw what had already happened." Ryan looked down, then asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come to pick me up?" Claire considered the question only briefly. "You still would have needed my signature." His expression shifted, not with anger this time, but recognition. The flight board above them changed with a soft electronic click. Victor called Claire's name from the security corridor, asking about a deployment threshold on the next phase. She lifted one hand in acknowledgement, then turned back to Ryan. There was no reconciliation waiting between them, only the clean distance left after truth had finished its work. Claire walked toward her team without looking over her shoulder. She had gone to surprise her husband at the airport and watched him walk out holding his mistress's hand. But the secret he had misjudged was simpler than revenge. He could leave the marriage with Madison, yet he had never been entitled to walk away carrying Claire's 41%, her authority, or the future she had built.